Welcome! So in this first video of a 9-piece series, I want to talk you through the assembly of the Warhound Titan from Games Workshop / Forge World. That's my first Titan build. As you can hear, I'm not a native English speaker, but I will try to do my very best to guide you through the overall process. If you think you have other ideas and you realize, oh, I have a better idea, please feel free to share this in the comment section. This whole build is so huge that I honestly had trouble recording everything due to the sheer size of my setup. But I hope that the individual parts will provide you with some good tips and some inspiration, and maybe help you a little bit if you plan to do this yourself. It's a very long series, so I apologize already. The majority of the videos are between 10 and 30 minutes. I tried to condense that, but my intention was to make this build as stable as possible. So I did a lot of pinning with brass rods, I used a lot of epoxy glue, and I also did a few mistakes, and especially these mistakes are something I want to talk about. So let's start. As you can see here, this is the plasma blast gun, and what I did, I just want to review the overall mold and show you what I have figured out. As you can see here, these little rips in the cables, they are quite detailed, and later with some filing you won't see that. You have these huge chunks of resin at the end of each piece, and as you can see here, there are also these cables which have still the resin in the middle. You see here some mold lines directly on top of the weapon, but overall I would say it's a pretty decent product, and with a little bit of filing and sanding, you can get rid of the mold lines. I was pleasantly surprised that especially the trim was the overall build quite okay. You have a few pieces of resin here and there, but in general it's a good build and definitely something you can easily work with. Here the plasma coils, you have some residues in the middle, but honestly painted and shaded you won't see that honestly. There was also some little piece of green silicone in one of the holes for the plasma units, I would call them. So interesting how that worked through their process. So, well, maybe their original form got a little bit damaged. Finally, funny, you have very basic information about to assemble on the piece, but with the sheer size you have like you've written top on top of the joint for the elbow. So here's what I used: standard knife, scrapers, although not really effective for resin, but I used them for a while for certain pieces. That's very important. That's my Redgrass Game cutter, which creates really clean cuts. I can just recommend that tool. Yeah, check it out. I think Green Stuff World has a similar tool, but these have been the first two companies where I realized they offer something like that. Here are some files, of course, some saws. These are very soft files, a little bit squishy, so you can easily file difficult parts in different grid, in different grids. This is a very basic, I think this is still my old Games Workshop saw, and I bought some metal saw blades, not so-called all-around blades, so I want to have a clear clear cuts, especially for the big chunks of resin. This is just a polishing pad. They come up to, I think, 12,000. The higher the number, the finer the polishing will be. This is really for the last touch. Yeah, so some metal files, different shaped differently to use for difficult parts of the model. Yeah, as you can see, I used, in the majority of times, I used the saw for the bigger chunks, and I can just recommend here to use the top screw to tighten the overall saw. Yeah, so really put your blade in between, apply some pressure with your thumb, and then screw the saw and fix everything, which will give you a very sturdy saw blade, which will also help you not to snap it. So you can theoretically cut these pieces with a cutter, but sometimes, especially in this build, they are way too large, so it won't fit. And with nippers, you have to be careful, because sometimes resin will, it's very brittle and will, break, and also break the parts you do not want to break. So use a saw whenever you can, and nippers on other locations whenever you see it fitting. So I started here cutting, sawing all these resin blocks from the pieces itself, and yeah. So after the cutting, I immediately started to grind and to file the piece a little bit, so to get everything ready for assembly. What I do, I wash my resin parts after I have removed all the mold lines and the casting pieces. So you won't see me washing them in this video, but in one of the next videos. I just spent some time here to explain this to you, because I think this basic setup is important. So the manual is quite simple, honestly very simple in comparison to other builds you have, but not uncommon to Forge World builds if you have done a few of them before. So you have really to think about assembly later, but I will get back to you and explain this in detail when we are coming to the real assembly. This is now just the preparation. I will also fast forward these things when I have explained to you the basic concept. You can snap parts when you cut I don't know, like 70% of it, but be careful. I would just take your time, file and saw, and use your saw in a calm manner to avoid any issues later. Resin is tricky. Here for filing, I really take my time. I file these little cutting parts, and I test fit everything usually, so it can ensure a smooth build later. These plasma parts had also some little mold lines, some little impurities, where I used a metal file, you can see here, specifically shaped here with a sharp edge, or like a triangular shape, to really come into the edges, but to keep the sharp edges you can get from resin. So do not apply too much pressure, take your time. This is such a great model, and it deserves enough time to do that. Here you can see this big chunk of resin at the end, and some supporting parts. And which I cut with a hobby knife, but you can also use your nipper to do that, whatever is your preference. With these huge pieces, I can just tell this again, a knife won't bring you anywhere. So definitely use your saw to do that, and try to get a really clean cut, because in this part you have additional connectors for the cables, and you will glue these connectors over the parts. So be careful not to remove the square parts close to the blast gun. Just remove the big chunk of resin here, as you can see here, because the connectors will fit over it. That's something important to know. Here as well, check the cut, take your time, so you can ensure you have the right angle to do that. You do not want to cut into your model, so yeah, take your time. Something on a side note here, you are creating a lot of resin flakes and dust and everything, so really take time to clean your working place with a vacuum cleaner from time to time. Otherwise your whole working area, living room, kitchen, wherever you do these things, will be covered in sawdust, and I really found this stuff everywhere. So really use something to get rid of it. Even from this one blast gun, my whole keyboard, my whole cutting mat was covered by resin, and you don't want that. So as you can see here, I had a pretty clean cut for the connectors, but of course there is a little there are some other parts, some little parts you really want to sharpen, and I started with a hobby knife to really cut these edges, carefully scrape these parts away, to create some sharp edges, and to have then later a smooth build. So I fast forward this to 500%. That's not so interesting to watch, so I will just summarize this here. When I file, that's important, apply pressure on the middle of the file, where you are really filing. If you don't do that, you will round the edges. So always, like you can see here, really try to get as much surface area as possible covered, and apply gentle pressure directly on the area you are filing and sanding. Otherwise you will just round the edges, and you don't want that. So yeah, this funny little green piece, I had to cut this out with a hobby knife. It's definitely silicone. I don't know, I think this part slipped a little bit, or their mold, their form was overused, so I had to remove the green silicone from the cavity here with a hobby knife. But I found this quite interesting, and it was the only area where I found that. Yeah, so after a while, it took me, I don't know, 10 minutes, I was able to finish the blast gun in total. I'm now carefully removing the resin part between the cables and the weapon itself, You can carefully do this with a hobby knife and later file this a little bit. Be careful not to hurt yourself, and especially your other finger. Apply gentle pressure and work with a really new sharp knife all around the length of the cable, and then the lower part towards the blast gun to free the cables from the resin residue. I think this is not entirely necessary, and especially on a scale of that with that model, you won't see it and realize it later because it's also on the lower part of the weapon. But you know, whatever you want and how perfect you want your model to be, take your time for these things. These little things go a long way, and as I said before, such a great model deserves more attention. So I fast forward again. In the later videos I fast forward much more, but especially in the first ones I want to really show you what I actually do, how I scrape, how I handle that, because especially I think for beginners this is interesting. So one of the blast guns was more difficult to clean than the other one, especially here on top of the weapon. These are the things and the molds you see, and you do not want to have these and to handle these later. But as I said before, it's a great build, and cleanup was not so difficult when I compare it to other builds like the Fire Wrap the Gunship, for example, which is, I think, was the worst model I ever had and ever received. Especially not only cleanup but also for the assembling. I had nothing to do for the trims, the metal trims, and I left the coils like they are because you won't really see them and see these little dots and the little grain when it's painted and especially primed. So yeah, that's the blast gun. All the joints and the little plasma units, and yeah, I hope to see you again in part 2, where we will pursue our Warhound Titan. Thank you very much.